Well, hey, and welcome to another biblical and theological FAQ devotional. Today's question is, what's the deal with baptisms for the dead? Is that a biblical practice? Now, if you're listening to this outside of the state of Utah, you might not think this is a very frequently asked question, but if you are in Utah, where Alpine Church is, you will certainly know this is a very commonly asked question because the idea of baptism for the dead is a very prominent idea in LDS or Mormon theology. What the idea is that a person is baptized on behalf of a dead person, and so a person will go in and physically be water baptized on behalf of somebody who has already died, and the intent is that practice will somehow help them to progress spiritually in the afterlife, and that is a necessary task that needs to be performed if they're going to progress in the afterlife. And so this is a major practice that goes on in LDS temples. On the main floor of every LDS temple, there's a baptismal font, and that's one of the major activity that goes on in the temples. And so it's a very commonly asked question here in Utah, and the question we should always wrestle with is this a biblical idea? It's something that we should do because the Bible teaches it. Well, the place where the Bible mentions it is the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Notice what it says. The Apostle Paul says this, "Now if there is no resurrection, what will those do who are baptized for the dead? If the dead are not raised at all, why are people baptized for them? And as for us, why do we endanger ourselves every hour?" So that's the passage, the only place in the Bible that baptism for the dead is referenced. Now here's a few important things to understand about this passage. We'll hopefully make sense out of it. One is, if you look at the context, which is always important in studying the Bible, the context of 1 Corinthians 15 is about the resurrection of Jesus and its consequences for our lives. The reason we have hope of a resurrection is because Jesus was resurrected. So it's not at all, the chapter isn't about baptism or baptism for the dead at all. It's about the resurrection. That's very important to understand the context. Secondly, notice that Paul, when he talks about it, he doesn't endorse it. He doesn't encourage us to do it. He simply references it in passing, actually as an illustration. He sort of references that it's going on as a practice, but he never says, and you should do this. He simply talks about it. And notice this in verse 30. I think this is very significant. As he's talking about it, notice how he describes it. He talks about the people who are being baptized for the dead, but then in verse 30 he says this, "And as for us, why do we endanger ourselves?" So again, notice that he separates himself out and the teaching of the apostles out from what was going on with the Corinthians. He refers to the people that were doing this as those people who are baptized from the dead. Why are those people baptized from them? So he's kind of creating an us versus them. He's not saying that this is what all Christians are doing. He's simply saying there are these group of people doing it, but us, we don't do this. He separates himself out, which I think is very important. And so what's going on there? He's probably simply talking about some more bad theology and practice that was coming from the Corinthians. If you read 1st and 2nd Corinthians in the Bible, you discover they were full of bad teaching, bad theology, and bad practice in their life. They were full of all kinds of weird, immoral stuff that was going on. So it's not surprising that they would pick up some bad theology. Most likely this was a practice they picked up from the pagan cultures. It wasn't uncommon in a lot of the pagan cultures surrounding the Corinthians to engage in stuff that had to do with ancestors and ancestor worship and stuff going on for dead people. That was common in those days. And so it's not unlikely that the early Christians, as they were trying to figure out theology, picked up that practice from those pagan nations around them. And I think it's very important to understand, just when you're trying to understand how to interpret theology, you should never base theology off of one passage, especially an obscure passage. And this is the only place in the whole Bible this is even referenced in passing, so it'd be very unwise to base a lot of theology off it. And the reason why is this. When you do look at the Bible, what you discover is that a person's eternal destiny is determined while they're alive. And once you're dead, that's it. It says this very clearly in Hebrews 9:27. It says, just as people are destined to die once, and after that to face judgment. So we die, and then we're judged. There's nothing that goes on in the afterlife that can face where we go. So that's why it's important to make sure you've got your relationship with God figured out before you die. Now, just take a minute and think about this. What is the biblical purpose of baptism? If you don't know, check out Foundations.